Hello and welcome to everyone who's here for our lunchtime workshop on the recent developments on the Japanese Corporate Governance Code. The UCL Centre for Ethics and Law is very proud to bring you this event today. I am Iris Chu, Director of the Centre, and with me are my guests today, our keynote speaker, Professor Watanabe, as well as a panel of discussants, and our own distinguished chair in Japanese law, Professor Oda, will close the event for us. So I'll first talk about the order of proceedings very briefly before I introduce the speakers. In terms of the order of proceedings today, we'll first have our keynote address by Professor Watanabe, who will talk about his thoughts on the recent developments of the Japanese Corporate Governance Code in the context of reforms that have gone on before. After that, Professor Mark Moore will provide comments for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then Sachi Suzuki of Federated Hermes Asset Management will be providing her comments from the perspective of an institutional investor for about the same length of time. I will then take Q&A from the audience, and so I do encourage you to submit your questions through the Q&A function, which I'll be looking at and moderating towards the Q&A session. If there are too many questions, I'll be selecting a few to direct to our panelists, but hopefully we can answer all of your questions within the time that we have for the event. And finally, Professor Hiroshi Oda, who is Sir Ernest Sato Professor of Japanese Law at the Faculty of Laws at UCL, will then close the event. So in terms of our speakers, their bios are all available on our website for registration. I hope you can have a good read there, but I'll just briefly introduce all of them here. Our keynote speaker is Professor Hiroyuki Watanabe, who is now visiting professor at Chubu University and is also research fellow at the Waseda Institute for Business and Finance. We are very delighted that he's here with us to share his recent insights and critical thoughts on developments in the Japanese Corporate Governance Code. Professor Mark Moore, who is our first discussant, is chair in Corporate and Financial Law at UCL Faculty of Laws. Mark has written extensively on many aspects of corporate governance as well as corporate finance, and is perfect for providing for us his point of view, hopefully with a comparative paradigm. Sachi Suzuki represents Hermes, an active investor looking at corporate governance issues and voting in Japan. And we hope she'll provide us with insights from the ground as to what institutional investors think of the recent reforms. And finally, Professor Oda, our own chair in Japanese law, will be giving his closing remarks, hopefully from a high-level perspective of what all this means in terms of Japanese business and the future of corporate governance ahead. So without further ado, I'll now give the floor to Professor Watanabe. Can I please invite Professor Watanabe to speak? Thank you.
Good afternoon and good evening, everybody. I'm Watanabe from Japan, Waseda University and Chubu University. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here as a speaker today. I really thank all the people concerned, in particular, Professor Iris Chu, who is the organizer of this seminar. My background on the screen is British House, Yokohama, in Japan. It's comfortable and one of my favorite places in Japan. So today's my presentation theme is Japan's Corporate Governance Code from the perspective of sustainable growth of the company and improvement of medium to long-term corporate value. Can you see my slides? Okay. So this perspective is a very subtitle of the code since the establishment of it and key concept of the code. My presentation structure is as follows. First, I'll explain the background and objective of Japan's Corporate Governance Code. And next, explain the transition of the code and main revision items. Then I'd like to point out some contributions and side effects of the code, and also make some comments from the perspective of improvement of medium to long-term corporate value, etc. The code has been created and published by the Tokyo Stock Exchange. So the code has been created and applied based on listing rules at the Tokyo Stock Exchange. And a principle-based approach and a comply or explain approach has been adopted. So under such a code regime, target listed companies should make and disclose corporate governance report based on listing rules and timely disclosure rules. Excuse me. So foundation of Japan's corporate governance code lies in the Japan revitalization strategy under Abe administration, and it has been formulated as part of Japan's economic growth strategy. Its special feature of Japanese corporate governance, as indicated in the subtitle. So as a predecessor of the code in Japan, there was a principles of corporate governance of listed company issued in 2004. In a wider sense, it's the first corporate governance code in Japan. Features made modeled after OECD principles of corporate governance. And I myself was a little involved in creation of this principle. Well, in a narrow sense, in 2015, Japan's corporate governance code was established first, and in 2018, underwent first revision. And this year, June 2021, second revision. So since the first 2050 version, the code has 5 general principles. One is securing the rights and equal treatment of shareholders. 2, appropriate cooperation with stakeholders other than shareholders. 3, ensuring appropriate information disclosure and transparency. 4, responsibility of the board. 5, dialogue with shareholders. And a note is added to each general principle, and there are many principles and supplementary principles in addition to the general principle. So there are 3 types of principles in Japan's corporate governance code: general principle, and supplementary principles. In 2018, the code underwent first revision. Main revisions are the following ones. 1, reduction of policy held shares, so-called cross-shareholding, which is a strong feature of traditional Japanese economy. 2, establishment of procedures for appointing and dismissing the CEO. 3, establishment of objective and transparent procedures in the compensation system. And 4, soliciting the role of corporate pension funds as so-called asset owners. And 5, understanding capital costs, reviewing business portfolios, and allocating resources worthless. And in addition, in line with this 2018 revision of the code, the guideline for investor and company engagement, so-called guidelines, positioned as a supplement document of the code, were also compiled. It prescribes the implementation and disclosure of policy, strategy, and system of code principle. In This year, June this year, the code underwent second revision, and this is the current new Japan's corporate governance code. This revision new code was issued on 11th June this year and was deemed effective from the same day. It was timed to coincide with the launch of the new market division system, that is prime, standard, and gross market of the Tokyo Stock Exchange, is scheduled to start in next April. It's the total reorganization of listed market at Tokyo Stock Exchange. And in the prime market, which is a market that upgraded the first section of the Tokyo Stock Exchange, and most of the companies listed on the current first section of Tokyo Stock Exchange are expected to be including. In the prime market, higher standards will be required in comparison to other markets and those established by the previous code. For example, ratio of independent outside directors on the board of directors. I think there are three special features in new code: board independence, sustainability, and diversity. As for board independence, for prime market, more than 1/3 of independent outside directors are needed. And if there is a controlling shareholder, majority independent outside director is needed. While for other market, standard and gross, 2 or more independent outside directors are needed. And if there is a controlling shareholder, more than 1/3 is needed. As a related point, new code sets some principles for functioning of the board. For example, creation and disclosure of skill matrix. Excuse me, there is a mistype. Skill matrix of the directors. Also, the new code strengthens the system and disclosure on business strategy and risk administration, etc. As for sustainability, disclosure of sustainability initiative and investment in human capital should be introduced. For prime market, disclosure of policies and impact on climate change within the framework of the TCFD is needed. TCFD means Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, created by the Financial Stability Board, international regulatory body. Next, regarding diversity, in the new code, the principle under the new code, principle of diversification of managerial positions should be introduced, and specifically women, foreigners, and mid-career employees are listed, and voluntary target setting and disclosure are required. Moreover, there is a need to disclose specific internal environment, human resource development policies, and implementation status to ensure diversity. So please note that with respect to the board diversity, 2018 version, first revision of the code required the companies to ensure diversity in terms of gender and nationality. So then I would like to point out some contributions of the Japan's code. First, change the behavior of shareholders. Traditionally, shareholders of Japanese companies have only weekly exercised the supervisory power. However, the situation has changed significantly since the establishment of the corporate governance code in 2015. The introduction of the code has triggered a positive exercise of rights and engagement by shareholders and is believed to have brought about a major change in the behavior of shareholders of the companies listed on the Tokyo Stock Exchange. Second contribution, I think, is to match the international standards. New Code 2021 revision has enhanced the principles of board independence, sustainability, diversity, etc., considering recent international trends. And the new code, new code is designed to match the international standards expected of listed companies. On the other hand, it seems that there are some side effects of the code. One is abuse of shareholder rights. As I said, introduction of the code triggered the active exercise of rights and engagement by shareholders. However, because the authority of shareholders under company law is much stronger in Japan than even in the United States, Delaware state. So in recent years, there have been abuse of shareholder rights by some shareholders against the backdrop. And recently, Japan has been ridiculed as an activist paradise. Second side effect, is delisting to avoid strong market pressure. Japan's corporate governance code strongly recommend the abolition of cross-shareholding and takeover defense measures. In particular, since first revision. And it is said that these have decreased sharply in Japan in recent years due to the cause influence. So these have led to the disappearance of stable shareholders and the threat of hostile takeovers and lead to the threat of hostile takeovers. So the pressure from the stock market has been very strong, and recently the number of listed companies planning to delist by conducting management buyout has been increasing significantly. Here, let's take a look at about the strong shareholder rights under the Japan's Companies Act. In Japan, shareholders' rights have been exercised on a wide range of matters at shareholders' meeting, including exercising strong direct control over the accountability of management oversight. In contrast, in the United States, function and authority to detect management oversight is being increasingly delegated to the board of directors, and shareholder rights regarding shareholders' meeting are limited in law. For example, deciding dividends. And in the United States, furthermore, regarding the amendment to the Articles of Incorporation, if the board of directors submit a proposal for the shareholder meeting, the shareholders only have veto rights and cannot present a shareholder proposal, unlike in Japan. Excuse me. Under such circumstances, the Toshiba incident, dispute with overseas activist fund occurred. They say that it exposed the limits of supervision by outside directors because the Toshiba was at the very first stage in Japan, introduced US type company with committee and regarded as the model company in terms of corporate governance. But I think it is also an opportunity to realize the fundamental importance of dialogue with shareholders in corporate governance. So you realize that what is important is dialogue with shareholders based on the perspective of improving the long-term corporate value. For example, Japan's code emphasizes the importance of capital cost in Code Principle 5.2. In addition, in recent years in Japan, ROE, return on equity-oriented management, has been often claimed. Typically, in so-called Ito review made by Japanese ministry. So the background of such a trend is the low ROE, return on equity, of Japanese companies. It's true, but the major cause of this in Japanese company is low return on sales. Therefore, the fundamental issue is how to improve the company's inherent earning power. So in terms of this, for example, share buyback can temporarily improve the level of ROE, but it does not directly contribute to the improvement of the company's inherent earning power. So then you might ask how we should do. The idea that both business and society can benefit might seem too good to be true. However, rigorous evidence suggests that companies that treat their stakeholders well deliver superior long-term return to investors. Creating value for stakeholders is not just a worthy idea, but also a good business sense. If companies make social value the goal and remember the indispensable principles, in short, good strategy and appropriate oversight by shareholders, more often than not, profit will follow. So we should return to the way of thinking that the company grows the pie by working to achieve its purpose under the oversight of shareholders, and as a result enhances the interests of its stakeholders. Recently, such a view has been advocated mainly by Alex Edmonds, London Business School, who is a friend of mine. So lastly, I'd like to conclude my presentation. The introduction of the corporate governance code in Japan has triggered a positive exercise of rights and engagement by shareholders of the companies. And 2021 code has enhanced the principle of board independence, sustainability, diversity, etc., considering recent international trends. However, from the point of improving the earning power that is the driving force for Japanese companies and improving the corporate value over the medium to long term, the code has not provided enough principles, and there is substantial room for betterment. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Watanabe, for your introduction to the recent reforms and your thoughts on the developments in the Japanese Corporate Governance Code. Can I now call on Mark to provide your comments, please?
So thank you, Iris. Thank you, Professor Watanabe, for an extremely interesting and informative presentation, which I've learned a lot from, and it is interesting to hear the extent of the corporate governance developments that have been taking place in Japan, and also how radical some of those developments seem to be in comparison to the tradition, or at least in comparison to what we in the West would regard as the traditional Japanese corporate governance model. So I have a few comments, observations to make, but on the whole, I thought the paper was a fascinating read. I also think that Professor Watanabe makes a very convincing argument in relation to the limitations of the recent corporate governance reforms in terms of improving the fundamental drivers of of earning power for companies. And my argument, or how could I put it, I don't want to say disagreement, but my argument with Professor Watanabe's presentation is maybe in relation to how feasible the total pie model of corporate governance is to bring about within the current corporate governance climate in Japan. And I'll explain what I mean in a moment. So a few observations to make. Most of the things Professor Watanabe said, I entirely agree with. And of course, I am speaking from a Western comparative point of view. So I do apologize to Japanese listeners if anything I say is misrepresenting or misunderstanding the Japanese system. And I would fully expect you to correct me if that is the case. But Professor Watanabe said in his talk that the Japanese Corporate Governance Code, and especially the most recent 2021 edition of the code, is focused on trying to bring Japan in line with international corporate governance standards. And when we say international corporate governance standards, looking at the types of reform that Japan have brought about, they do seem to be very Western, predominantly American-inspired reforms. Like so much stuff in corporate governance globally, when we talk about international norms, usually what people tend to mean is American norms, with limited exceptions. And my first, I guess I don't know if this is something that Professor Watanabe would disagree about himself, but I'm always personally uncomfortable with the idea of other countries openly transplanting Western, particularly Anglo-American corporate governance norms into their own national systems. And I mean, there is a general problem here that's been well identified by comparative lawyers for a long time, which is, of course, Alan Watson's classic notion of legal transplants. And I think, okay, we're not talking about law as such here, we're talking about soft law, as Professor Watanabe pointed out. But I think the same basic principle applies. The same basic problem exists, that transplanting a law or regulation from one jurisdiction to another, as comparative lawyers will tell us, it's a bit like transporting an organ from one human body to another. You cannot expect that organ to work the same in an alien environment. And I think this has been proved to be the case with corporate governance norms, even soft law norms. And it does concern me that a country with a rich and sophisticated institutional tradition of corporate governance, which is very heavily based on its unique culture, particularly the traditional Keiretsu network system, it does slightly concern me from a foreigner's point of view that Japan would be so open to embrace foreign corporate governance norms, or corporate governance norms that were traditionally regarded as foreign. In the case of a developing country that does not have a corporate governance tradition, I can see why there's a strong case for openly adopting Western, especially American norms. But for Japan, a system which has its own very rich, developed, endogenous economic and especially corporate culture, it does slightly concern me that Japan has been so open to adopting these corporate governance norms. And I think more than any other country I could think of, I can see this transplant issue being a problem. And I actually think it has been a problem. And we've seen that in cases like Toshiba, where there has been clear conflict between Western pro-shareholder corporate governance norms and endogenous Japanese governance norms. And I think the more Japan is happy to embrace Western corporate governance norms and try to incorporate them into their system, I think those conflicts, those cultural conflicts will become more prevalent, or at least that would be my assumption. So that is something that concerns me. I'm not saying Japan should not be open to adopting other norms, but it does concern me about how, I think a significant degree of caution is called for, at least if we look at examples from other relevant countries. But I do accept that recent years, the last few years, have been something of a zeitgeist moment for Japanese corporate governance. And I think of the Toshiba crisis as being rather similar to the Enron crisis in the United States 20 years ago, which was a huge, I mean, the difference is, of course, Toshiba survived, Enron did not. But it was a similarly epochal moment, really, in signalling a shift in attitudes to corporate governance and bringing in significant corporate governance reforms. In the US, it was in the form of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act and other related reforms. Also, the UK, even though we were not directly impacted by Enron in 2001, the UK in 2002 radically reformed its corporate governance code. And that was when we first introduced majority independent boards as a general norm in listed companies in the UK. So I can see Toshiba being a similar landmark moment in that regard. So I do appreciate, given the significance and the impact of the events in this case, not just the initial accounting fraud that caused the problems, but also the way it was subsequently responded to. I can see why responsive regulation is required. And it's only natural that there would be significant code reforms in response to these events. Now, I notice Professor Watanabe does seem, like me, to be sympathetic to stakeholder models of corporate law. And I do notice, this idea of growing the pie and not just being focused on shareholders' returns, and the need to correct fundamental drivers of corporate performance, not just improve return on equity. Now, that sits uneasily against the picture which Professor Watanabe also presented in his talk, which was the picture of Japan as a perceived activist shareholder paradise. Activist paradise, I think, was the term that you mentioned. Now, this is a situation that I don't see changing. In my understanding, and again, my understanding of Japanese corporate governance is much less extensive than the other panelists here, but from an outsider's point of view, I don't see the influx of activist investors in Japan as being a temporary phenomenon that's going to go away, even though I appreciate many people might want it to go away. But it seems to me that activist investors are most likely the new normal. Institutions like FSIMO, who were particularly prominent in the Toshiba affair, the big American activists like Elliott Management and Third Point, they've clearly targeted Japan. They see it as a place that's ripe for making significant returns on equity compared to other markets. And it's quite curious, if I just flick down to the next slide for a moment. This was actually some statistics in today's Financial Times, a piece on shareholder activism in Japan. And it's quite curious to see this difference here. So the orange or yellow line, I'm not quite sure what color it is, but the orange line is the ratio of enterprise value to operating income of S&P 500 firms. So basically, essentially the biggest US listed companies by market cap. And the blue line is the TOPIX index constituents ratio of enterprise value to operating income. So essentially what this ratio is measuring is, on the one hand, the stock market value of the companies, how much their shares are worth, versus the underlying operating income of the business. And you can see that the premium of market value to underlying business value, that premium seems much bigger, much more significant in US listed companies than it is in Japanese listed companies, which does make me wonder, well, clearly this is still a clarion call to activist investors that there are potential underlying gains to be made in Japan from shareholder activism. And I do wonder, I mean, one area where I would maybe possibly disagree slightly with Professor Watanabe is in your talk, Professor, you seem to say that shareholder activism is being encouraged in Japan by the pro-shareholder company law framework and the fact that Japan gives more significant shareholder rights than, for example, US corporate law does. Personally, I'm not sure how much of a driver that is. And I personally, which is a bit ironic as I'm a corporate lawyer, but I do subscribe to the theory that law, or at least company law, ultimately doesn't really matter when it comes to activist shareholder power. The most powerful activist shareholders in the world are in the United States, and they mainly operate in the United States, even though the United States does not have an especially shareholder-oriented corporate law framework. In fact, as you insightfully mention in your paper, Professor Watanabe, I beg your pardon, shareholders in the US have got significantly lesser legal rights than they do in most other major jurisdictions. So if Japan is an activist paradise, personally, I don't think it's so much a consequence of Japan's greater system of shareholder rights. I think it's more just, it goes back to the numbers in the graph I just threw up, that actually the perceived return on equity that's available for activist shareholders in Japan is generally seen to be greater, to be more attractive, to be more appealing than it is in other markets, such as the United States. And as long as that deficit, or as long as that premium, that comparative premium exists, I don't see the activist shareholders going away anytime soon. And they may just be something that Japan has to live with. Sorry, beg your pardon. I'm recovering from an illness, not COVID, I'm pleased to say. So that does make me slightly uncomfortable about about what Professor Watanabe is arguing for, which is this a model of corporate governance focused on improving underlying earning power rather than return on equity. And as long as there is an environment where activist shareholders are having a prominent influence, then my fear is return on equity will always be the prevailing consideration. And I'm not sure to what extent corporate governance code or other legal or regulatory reforms are going to be able to address that. And my final point is just other notable events that have taken place recently. I mean, in addition to corporate law developments, I'm aware, especially in the context of the Toshiba case, that Japan has been using powers under the Foreign Exchange Act as a way of trying to regulate foreign investment, principally in national security grounds. Now, Japan is not alone in doing that. All countries are doing that. The United States is very, very prominent in using its national security laws as a way of restricting overseas investment under the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, especially under the Trump administration. The UK, we're guilty of that as well. we've just reformed our Enterprise Act to give much stricter powers to the government to exclude foreign investments where they are seen to be a national security concern. My concern with all these innovations, not just Japan, we're as guilty as Japan. My concern is that under the cloak of national security concerns, a number of countries, a number of leading economies in the world are becoming more and more protectionist and are actually introducing what I would call Trojan horse economic protectionism, strategic economic protectionism of national industries, of national flag-bearing companies, disguised as national security. And bear in mind that national security today does not just include things like defense and nuclear energy, but increasingly now includes things like 5G technology and standard telecommunications. So that is a concern that worries me a lot. I know it was pertinent in the Toshiba case, where the Japanese government were quite heavily involved in trying to, how can I say, discourage, to put it mildly, the intervention of the foreign activist investors. And I think this is, alongside the corporate governance code, I can see this being a continuing issue, not just in Japan, in all major economies, as of course we enter a more nationalist and more protectionist global economic environment. So that's really my main observations. In conclusion, superb, really interesting, really inspiring paper. I've learned so much information that I have to share with my own students in Japan, thanks to Professor Watanabe. I'm just slightly skeptical about the feasibility of the reforms or the feasibility of the model and the vision of corporate governance that he would like to see develop in Japan. But I do very much hope I'm wrong about that, because the vision, the aspirations that he has are very, very admirable and very exciting ones. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mark, for your insightful comments. I think Professor Watanabe is probably likely to want to respond to these, but before that, I'll ask Sachi to speak, and then I'll give Hiroyuki an opportunity to respond to both the sets of comments before we take the Q&A. So can I give the floor to Sachi first? Thank you.
Thank you, Iris, and thank you very much, Professor Watanabe and Mark, for insightful discussion and presentation. So I'm Sachi Suzuki. I'm the lead engager for Japan at EOS at Federated Hermes. And today I am here to share some perspective from the investor side. So my team, EOS at Federated Hermes, EOS stands for Equity Ownership Services. And although we sit within the asset management business, our business model is slightly unique. We have, what we do is not to invest in companies. That's other investment teams' role. And our team is focused on stewardship services. And we have our own set of clients who are all long-term investors, mainly pension funds and some other asset owners and asset managers. They're global clients. And what we do is to engage with the companies where our clients hold shares in, and focused on long-term value creation. So we focus on environmental, social, governance issues especially. And we also advise them on exercising voting rights at the shareholder meetings. We also engage with regulators, stock exchange and government bodies on public policies as well. And what the importance of stewardship has been demonstrated in various studies, how active involvement of shareholders, investors, that doesn't necessarily equate activist investors that we've just heard about. We don't consider ourselves as activist investors, but we are active, representing active owners of companies, and that our involvement, we believe, that will lead to improvement in ESG performance credentials, and that will in turn lead to a long-term successful company and long-term shareholder returns as well. And we engage at EOS, we engage on various different issues of environmental and social governance and other more kind of long-term business strategies as well. As you can see in this chart, the governance issues are only kind of part of among many issues that we engage on, but we think that governance is a core of everything, and that has an overarching impact and influence in that without sound governance structure, the companies can't address and manage risks in other areas, environmental and social areas, for example. And within governance area, that we in Japan especially, we focus on board structure, board composition and effectiveness, and shareholder rights protection, and especially the issue of cross shareholdings, which we focus on today. So the board composition effectiveness, as Professor Watanabe presented earlier, since the introduction of corporate governance code in 2015, that included the first requirement for a minimum number of independent directors on the board, and that has a significant impact. And as you can see, that the vast majority of large companies now have 1/3 independents on the board, and we certainly welcome this change. This may contradict what Mark was saying, but from our point of view, we do think that independent representation on the board is very important, because independent directors are obviously there to monitor management and to hold them to account. But at the same time, they are there to represent and protect minority shareholders, like retail shareholders and institutional shareholders. And the Japanese company boards traditionally were effectively management boards, and that there was no real separation between executives and board directors. And very little independence, but that has changed in the last few years. But we do have some questions about the genuine independence of these directors, because they often come from business partners or major shareholders or other entities where the company has some business dealings with. Then the other aspect of board composition effectiveness that we look at is diversity, and we believe that a diverse board and also diverse management and diversity across all levels of companies is a key to success. And unfortunately, as you all know, Japan is a very male-dominated, homogeneous society, and as the chart shows, the female representation on the board is still very limited compared to many other key markets. And that's despite the changes and improvements in the recent years. And so we do welcome the recent revision to the code, and then now additional requirement for companies to set targets for increasing diversity among managers, senior management. But we are also disappointed that there's no specific requirement, even a minimum requirement for a number or a ratio of female directors on the board. And there's a lot of aspects of diversity, but the gender diversity is an area we think that Japan is most behind. So what we're asking companies to do, and also regulators to address through various codes and regulations to further increase board independence. The global best practice is majority, and is a common practice in the UK, in the US, and many other markets, and even in other Asian markets, 1/3, a minimum, a third of independence. That has been a norm for a long time. And like I said, it's important to ensure that those so-called independent directors are actually independent and have no conflicting interest. This is coming from an entity that has no other business dealing with the company, for example. And we'd like to see, obviously, more women on the board. For example, groups like a 30% club, where we are a member of the investor group, has a target to increase the board representation, female representation, to 30% by 2030 at Topics 100 companies. And this is also backed by Keidanren has expressed a similar target, which we welcome. And although female representation, gender diversity is our primary focus, we also think that the international presence and internationality on the board is very important, particularly for companies operating globally and have a large foreign shareholder base as well. And the other aspect, the board effectiveness, I think, is that we'd like to see a clear definition of the role of the chair. Again, because the Japanese boards have traditionally been a management board, the CEO, the president, have automatically assumed the role of the board of the chair as well. And there was no, again, a distinction between these two groups. So we'd like to see that their board having a different functions, the management, executive committee, and for that it's important to see ideally independent and non-executive chair of the board. But as a first step, we're encouraging companies to at least define the role of the chair more clearly. And a number of companies now have set up nomination and remuneration committees within the board, and that's very welcome. But their actual role and strength of the authority is often not clear. They're often there just for the advisory purposes, and some of them only meet once a year, and that's probably not really meeting the original expectation of the investors. And lastly, board evaluation is an important tool, helpful tool for the company and the board to understand how well their board is functioning and what areas they can improve, what skills sets they're lacking and that they can add. And it's important for this to be done by an independent third party, again, with no conflict of interest. The other issue that we focus on or put a lot of effort on is cross-shareholding. And you probably all know that this is a practice where companies hold each other's shares, and then despite the name cross, the holding is not always mutual. It could be unilateral holding by a supplier of a product, or manufacturer holding their buyers, retailers, shares, so that the buying contract is secure. And although the historical chart shows a decline in the level of these cross-shareholdings, still about 30% of the listed shares are held as cross-shareholdings, but between companies and banks and some security firms and insurance companies. And we still think it's too high as a level, because we still think that this practice leads to a number of problems. And as I mentioned, the purpose often is to for companies to maintain good relationships with other businesses, and that to win contracts or obtain preferential treatment, and that it's in conflict with the fundamental market principles of fair competition. So as a buyer, you should be selecting the supplier on the basis of quality of the products and services and competitive pricing, but instead a lot of companies are incentivized to choose a business partner based on shareholder relationships, and that's wrong from a point of view. And this is not also a best use of shareholder funds. The companies are not supposed to be investing in share stocks. And also this kind of cross-shareholding reduces the level of free float, because they don't really usually trade on these shares. And because these friendly, allegiant shareholders are allowed to support each other, so they often, they typically don't challenge the management of the other companies, or cast against votes at the shareholder meetings. They may block takeovers at the request of the company. So this can block, potentially block, efforts to improve corporate governance practice. And lastly, not least, this practice also leads to unequal treatment of shareholders, because the corporate shareholders, the cross-shareholding owners, they benefit from holding shares in a way that other non-business shareholders can't. So the companies, win contracts or have beneficial preferential treatment from shareholdings, but institutional shareholders or retail shareholders don't have those benefits. So what we're asking companies to do more is to unwind and reduce these cross shareholdings, ultimately to eliminate them. And as a first step, we would like to see specific time-bound targets for reduction and the disclosure of all those holdings, more transparency in terms of percentage and amount of these holdings. At the moment, only a set number of these holdings need to be disclosed under the current rule. And a lot of companies have tried, and the regulators have encouraged companies to provide explanation on why they're holding these shares, what the purposes are. But we think in most cases their notes they are very standardized and not very specific and unhelpful. So companies really, if they really believe that they need to hold these shares, then they need to be able to justify their reasons to shareholders. And lastly, also we'd like to see companies to disclose how they're exercising their voting rights on those shares in the same manner as institutional shareholders are required to. So what their policy is for exercising voting rights, and how they have actually exercised these votes. So yeah, that's from me. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sachi, for your thoughts. That there is a lot to take away for us. So we do have some questions on the Q&A, but I believe that Professor Watanabe would also like to respond to what Mark as well as Sachi has said. I'm just wondering if I can take chair's privilege to quickly sum up a few themes so that it might be easier to address them this way. I think the first theme that Joyman from our faculty has posed in the Q&A, as well as Mark has mentioned, is legal transplantation. I mean, to what extent the recent court revisions are really more kind of hearkening to international trends in the West, and are they meaningful actually for Japan? And I see from Sachi's last slide, the unique questions regarding cross-shareholdings is much more unique to Japan. Should the Japanese Corporate Governance Code actually more pertinently address these questions without the need to kind of follow international trends blindly, or is there really a need to incorporate the kind of everything good that we see around us? I think that is one question which I hope Hiroyuki can respond to. Shall I now ask Professor Watanabe to respond?
Thank you, Professor Chu. I'd like to respond to Professor Moore's question and participant's question. Thank you very much for your excellent comment and presentation, Professor Moore and Mrs. Suzuki. As Professor Moore pointed out, Japan is now in conflict between traditional culture and Western culture through introduction of corporate governance code. And there should be a transparent problem, as he pointed out. But now things are changing. As Mrs. Suzuki focused on cross-shareholding problem. After introducing corporate governance code in Japan, cross-shareholding and parent subsidiary listing has been decreasing sharply. So now things are very changing. And as I said, now in Japan called activist paradise. So many activists from US, Europe, and Hong Kong already actively engaging with Japanese companies and made some good achievement, I suppose. And Toshiba case is very interesting, and I'm myself very have a special interest. But please note that it's a very special case, although it reflects traditional Japanese culture in business society. The major background of this incident is first, Japanese government, Japanese ministry induced Toshiba to invest in US nuclear business, but it failed. Battery failed. So Japanese ministry have a strong obligation for Toshiba. So it's a very important background. So, and in principle, it would be legal for the ministry to take discretionary measure from national security perspective based on the act. For example, about inward foreign direct investment. However, regulation on inward foreign indirect investment, including the acquisition of shares and consent joint exercise of voting rights, which are closely related to company law. So exercise of authority under such act law should be should be exclusively focused on the national security perspective, so as not to erode the scope of company law. So Toshiba case, in my view, suggests that understanding how to build a substantially effective governance system, not merely formalizing it through the ratio or number, is a fundamental issue, I think. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hiroyuki, for your response. I think Professor Oda has a point to add at this point. Can I call on Professor Oda to speak, please?
Now, can you hear me? Yeah. Now, I'm supposed to sort of wrap up the conference, the symposium. But before that, I just wanted to ask some questions, couple of questions, which was inspired by Professor Moore's comment, but also I have a question about the question to Professor Watanabe, and that's on page 15 of the slide, page 15 of the slide. Now, you say that in Japan, shareholders' rights have been exercised on a wide range of matters at shareholders' meetings. That's true, including exercising strong direct control over the accountability of management oversight. Now, you are contrasting this to the US system. In contrast, in the US, the function and authority to detect the management oversight, etc., is increasingly delegated to board of directors. I think this is an overstatement in the sense that, well, as compared to Delaware law, it may be the case that the shareholders' power is broader on the statute in Japan, but actually, if you look at the practice, it is very different. And one thing is that, for instance, the various matters which come under the power of the shareholders are delegated to the board by the articles of incorporation. So, for instance, distribution policy of the profits, that's usually delegated to the board. It's not a matter of a shareholders meeting. And there are all sorts of other things. So I think this presentation, I think it was a great presentation, but I'm not sure about this point. If the, well, as you say, well, some people say that Japan is a paradise of activists. I'm not sure whether it's an paradise, or I'm not sure whether that is because the Japanese company law gives too much power to shareholders or authority to shareholders. Because if you look at the United States, where the board's power is board has the extensive power as contrast to sorry, excessive power, but still the activists are very active, and so whether the activists are active or not, that does not really depend on the statute or company law or the code. That's a brief comment on here, and later I will sort of summarize the outcome of this symposium. So I'll go mute.
Right, thank you very much, Hiroshi. I think we do have probably on the panel different points of view on the level and extent of shareholder power and its advantages and drawbacks in Japan. I can see that Professor Watanabe's skepticism of empowering them too much, but for example, Sachi is still talking about wanting to see more changes and hopefully shareholders to be able to call board members or the board to account better. And of course, Mark's view that perhaps corporate law and corporate governance do not matter, and we'll see activist investors push in anyway to try and get this landscape changed. I think this is a very, very dynamic landscape indeed, in terms of the desirability of probably the legal content of shareholders' power and also its exercise. I'm just wondering on this point whether all three speakers on our panel can comment on this. Professor Watanabe, do you want to add a few things to this?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Iris, and thank you so much for your comment, Professor Oda. It's a great honor to work together today. So I agree with you, Professor Oda, and also Professor Mua. My intention is not to does not mean that the shareholder power in US are weak, but under the law, under the company law, shareholders power in Japan, Japanese company are very strong. So as Professor Professor Moore suggested, other than law, the theory is maybe utmostly important. In US, the theory maximizing shareholder value is at most backed by law and economics theory. So we cannot overlook it. So I don't disagree with Professor Oda and Professor Moore in this point. Thank you.
Right, does Mark or Sachi want to add anything to the point about the level of shareholder power on this exercise being at least perceived as being in flux in Japan? I mean, the sort of strength or weakness, as well as the drawbacks and advantages that accompany such perceived strength or weakness.
Yeah, I did say, and we do think that a lot of improvements need to be made in terms of board composition and cross shareholdings. But we are well aware of the discussion purposes and also the concerns about shareholder primacy in the Western markets, and so our team's also heavily involved in these discussions in various markets. But I think there are some aspects in Japan that where some areas that shareholder rights are not adequately protected, and the discussion on board diversity, it's not necessarily, so I highlighted the benefits for shareholder protection and interest of shareholders and minority shareholders, but I think this is important, that the board having diverse board. It's I think important for wider good of the society as well, in companies addressing wider issues, the environmental, social issues, looking after their own employees and workers in the supply chain and the global environment. So that I just want to clarify that we're not just focused on maximizing shareholder value, especially in the short term.
Thank you, Sachi. I think maybe the whole dilemma turns on what sort of shareholders we're talking about and whether activist ones are particularly short-termist or otherwise. I mean, there are contrary studies, I think, in relation to what activist investors are looking for. But active investors like Hermes has always had a reputation for looking for long-term value. And many investors or institutional investors also align themselves with ESG goals and stakeholder value. So a lot of it, I think, is still playing out in practice. I'm just wondering whether Mark wants to add something at this point.
Sure, yeah. I mean, when we talk about activist investors here, I mean, you're right, Iris. I think we need to be quite clear about who we're referring to here. We're not referring to institutions like Sachi's institution. I mean, they're an engaged investor. I mean, activist is a bit of a pejorative. It's a bit of a negative term. Hermes Focus Fund are an engaged investor. I don't think we call them an activist investor in the sense that I believe Professor Watanabe's using that term. An activist investor is a very specific type of investor, not exclusively US based. I mean, the biggest, the most aggressive activist investor in the Toshiba case was actually from your country, Iris. It was a Singaporean institution. I mean, the activist investors we're talking about are investors who are not engaged on an ongoing basis with companies in the way that, for example, Saatchi's institution might be. They are in institutions like Elliott Management, Third Point, who take strategic holdings, who take strategic minority holdings, and who use them as a basis to agitate for change. They may ultimately threaten to take control of the company through a hostile takeover. They probably most likely won't do that, but they will threaten it and may ultimately look to extract certain concessions from the target companies, such as board seats, or maybe push for share buybacks or other relatively short-term measures that are in their interests. Now, an activist investor like Third Point or Elliott, they are never going to have the capital and the voting power to take control of a Japanese listed company. I mean, or any listed company. I mean, that's not what they do. Their power is premised on their ability to marshal the support of other bigger shareholders, like the mainstream institutions that you were talking about, Iris. And I think the power of activist investors in the US is largely premised on the influence that they can have over pension funds and mutual funds, the big investors that really do have the power to effect control changes. Now, Professor Watanabe said he thought the key difference between, for example, the US and Japan was that the ideological climate was different, and the law and economics idea of shareholder primacy is more pertinent in the US, and that may be true to some extent. But I also think a really key difference is if an activist investor agitates for change in the US, they will, or at least they can, certainly get the support of major mainstream institutions. If an activist investor agitates for change in Japan, I'm not so sure. And also, of course, we're dealing with a very different ownership framework as well, where, as Saatchi pointed out, there is still considerable cross-holding, albeit maybe to a lesser extent than in previous generations. But it's a much more complicated, interfused ownership framework, where I think it's more difficult for an activist to operate. So obviously activists are able to operate in Japan, but whether they'll have the same clout as they've had in places like the US, I'm not so sure. But I agree, there's a lot of variables, a lot of factors at play here, but certainly not just the law.
Right, thank you, Mark. I think Professor Oda has his hand up, but I will also at this point, I think, move towards the close of the event since we are coming towards the time. So can I invite Professor Oda to provide your closing remarks, as well as to include some of the comments that you wish to make in response to this in your remarks. Professor Oda, please.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. And as I understand, we are running out of time, and there are so many things to discuss here. So I think anyway, we need another occasion for the remaining topics. I just a quick comment on the Ms. Suzuki's. Well, she made a reference to the cross-shareholding. But the cross-shareholding was a major issue in the 1990s, but it's been substantially reduced, as Professor Watanabe commented, and actually it's not a major issue now. And I think the ratio of 30% is overstated. It's much lower than that these days, and it's not the case that the companies trade between the shareholders. That would make a business for companies. So I mean, it doesn't really affect the transactions of a company. Now, that's one thing. And the second, so I come to the, and also Toshiba case. Many people refer to Toshiba, but I didn't understand which aspect of Toshiba case people are referring to, because so Toshiba has been involved in the various problems, and ever since I think 2010, there are many so-called Toshiba cases, and the one is of course, as you mentioned, the foreign exchange. The government involved in the government allegedly supporting Toshiba vis-a-vis foreign investors. I'm not sure that's correctly reported. Yeah, but currently the real problem with Toshiba is that it was a flagship company of the Japanese industry, but it was in a way like General Electrics. But now it's probably going to be divided in 3 parts. So the Toshiba is not going to stay. It's going to be divided in smaller companies in 3 sectors. Well, a similar development happened took place in the US with General Electric, which was recently reported. And the point is that such a division of a major company was initiated by these, I don't know how you put it, by these funds which acquired shares of Toshiba. So that sort of caused the steered or caused the concern of the Japanese business community. Yeah, that's one thing to remember. Now so I go back. So I need to wrap up the symposium in 2 minutes. As Professor Moore pointed out, it's an interesting question. The interesting question is this possibility of transplanting a foreign system into a totally different soil. And we had a discussion ever since the probably 1990s. And at that time, the US influence of US system was predominant, and we all modeled the system after the US Delaware law. For instance, M&A system didn't work. The reason why it didn't work is not necessarily that the transportation was not correct, but the way they, we tried to cherry pick some parts of the system, but didn't work because the basic sort of infrastructure was missing. We just imported some instruments, and actually already in 2005, I wrote an article in the Ravel's Zeitschrift for comparative law about the Americanization of Japanese company law. But then the point is that, in the 2000s, we had what Professor Watanabe would call shareholder activism in a way, that we had funds coming to Japan and trying to take over Japanese companies, and there were some scandals as well. So people came very skeptical of the US influence on the Japanese system. So we turned to Europe. I wouldn't say Europe, to the UK. So we studied the UK codes, and then we introduced the system in 2015, which was recently revised. So that's the situation. So we are still rather skeptical of the US system, but then it is rather, the English system is also not easy to transplant. So we are facing that problem. But thank you very much. And I thought it was a very, you managed to put everything, to so many things within the framework of an hour and a half, and you were very successful. So congratulations.
Thank you, Professor Oda, for your very generous closing remarks. We did raise a lot of issues rather than really resolve them in the last kind of 86 minutes or so. So we thank all of our audience for staying with us. We thank our speakers, Professor Watanabe, for your insightful presentation, our discussants, Mark and Sachi, for your comments, as well as Professor Oda for gracing this occasion and closing with some of your reflections. Like I mentioned, hopefully we'll be able to broadcast this on YouTube after all of our speakers have approved the footage. And it remains for me to wish everybody a good day ahead. Thank you all for being here.